At dusk in the Arabian Sea, after 6 straight hours of warnings, the engine room on an Iranian flag cargo ship went dark. American voices had already come over the radio again and again. Vacate the engine room. Prepare for disabling fire. Then the destroyer fired. The ship lost propulsion. Night came down, and only after the ship was dead in the water did the helicopters arrive. That is the image I want you to hold in your mind. Not a summit photo, not a diplomatic statement, not a generic phrase about stability in the Gulf. A cargo vessel stopped in open water, Marines coming down by rope in the dark while talks were supposedly still alive. Because the real story is not that the United States boarded one ship. The real story is that Washington chose the one move most likely to destroy the political space for a peace deal, and in doing so handed Iran's hardliners and China exactly the kind of argument they needed. That is what this was. If you only watch the headline, you will think this is a story about enforcement. A ship refused warnings. The United States disabled it. Marines boarded. Case closed. But if you look at the structure, this becomes a very different story. You have to ask a harder question. Why do this now? Why do this in the middle of a negotiation window that both sides were still trying to keep alive? Why take a step that is so visual, so humiliating, so easy for the other side to frame as piracy, escalation, or proof that America is not serious about diplomacy? And once you ask that question, the whole thing opens up. 3 weeks ago, when the blockade on Iranian ports was announced, the argument from Washington was simple. More pressure would produce more flexibility, tighten the screws, raise the cost, keep Iran boxed in, and the negotiators on the Iranian side would come back weaker. That theory sounded tough. It also misunderstood the internal mechanics of the Iranian state. Because Iran is not one voice, it is at least two. There is the Iran of the foreign ministry, the men who can sit in Islamabad or Muscat or somewhere else and try to write language both sides can survive. Those people can sell a ceasefire, they can sell sequencing, they can sell ambiguity, they can even sell limited concessions if they can show their own system that diplomacy is buying time, reducing pain, and preserving dignity. Then there is the Iran of the Revolutionary Guard, the hardline security state, the faction that believes America always uses negotiations as cover for more pressure and more force. That faction does not need a perfect argument. It only needs one emotionally powerful piece of evidence, and America just gave it one. That is why the boarding matters. Not because one ship changes the military. It does not. Not because one boarding proves total control of the sea. It does not. It matters because of what it does inside Iran's argument with itself. The diplomatic camp can no longer say, give us more time, talks are still working. America is showing restraint. How can they say that after helicopters come down onto an Iranian flagged vessel in the dark? How can they say that after disabling fire, after a seizure operation, after footage that can run on every Iranian channel for days as proof that the Americans never meant pressure and diplomacy to be separate things? This is why I keep saying the mechanism matters more than the headline. The boarding gives the hardliners a clean story. They can now say, we told you so. We told you the ceasefire would not stop coercion. We told you negotiations would run beside force, not replace it. We told you every inch of flexibility would only invite a new humiliation. And inside a system like Iran's, that argument is devastating. You do not need everyone to believe it. You only need enough of the security apparatus, enough of the clerical establishment, enough of the decision-making chain to say, fine, then no more trust, no more symbolic openings, no more easy off-ramp. That is the first layer. The second layer is even more dangerous because the boarding did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a larger strategic environment that America still refuses to describe, honestly. This war is not just a two-player game between Washington and Tehran. It is a three-player game. And the third player is China. China does not need to send Marines. China does not need to fire a shot. China only needs to do what it has been doing for years. Keep Iran economically viable, keep the pressure from becoming collapse, and keep America trapped between escalation and overextension. That is the part too much coverage keeps missing. The blockade was supposed to create unbearable pressure, but pressure only works if the target has no outer support structure. Iran does. China spent years building it. Dark fleet tankers, transponders off, ship transfers, payments outside the dollar system. Tier Chinese banks with little exposure to Western enforcement. Small refineries willing to process crude that officially does not exist. Warehouses and routing systems designed to keep oil moving even when the formal channels are under sanction. That architecture was not built in response to this one crisis. It was built long before this crisis so that when a crisis like this arrived, Iran would still have enough oxygen to make political choices instead of being forced into surrender. That distinction is everything. If the blockade had actually cut Iran off from revenue in a decisive way, then maybe a harsh action at sea could have translated into negotiating leverage. But if the revenue still moves, if the outer financial architecture still holds, if China is still buying, then the pressure does not produce collapse. It produces resentment. And resentment, under those conditions, does not weaken the hardliners. It strengthens them. That is why the boarding is such a dangerous move. It is the kind of move that feels forceful on television, but can be self-defeating in strategy. It tells the American audience that something is being done. It tells the Iranian hardliners that they were right. It tells the negotiators on both sides that the room for trust just got smaller. And it tells China that America still has not solved the basic problem at the center of this confrontation. The basic problem is simple. Washington is trying to pressure Iran without directly confronting the Chinese infrastructure that keeps Iran from breaking. That means Washington is trying to win the visible layer of the conflict while leaving the hidden layer intact. And when you do that, every dramatic move risks turning into theater. Look at the choices in front of each side. Now, America has three broad paths. It can keep escalating tactical pressure like this and hope that enough pain accumulates before the diplomatic window closes. But that path keeps feeding the Iranian hardliner narrative, and every new visible action raises the chance of a retaliatory move at sea against shipping or against regional bases. It can pause and lean back into talks. But now that is politically harder because once you board a ship in front of the world, stepping back looks less like strategy and more like hesitation. Or it can try to widen the confrontation and put real costs on the Chinese system that keeps Iran afloat. But that would mean admitting publicly that this is not really just an Iran problem anymore. It would mean a much larger confrontation than Washington appears willing to enter. Right now, Iran also has three paths. The diplomatic Iran can keep trying to salvage the talks, arguing that one dangerous move does not eliminate the need for a deal that is still possible. But it is weaker now than it was before the boarding. The hardline Iran can answer with a new maritime action, a drone move, a tanker incident, or some controlled escalation designed to prove that force will be met with force. That path is emotionally satisfying inside the system. But it brings the risk of giving Washington exactly the broader conflict justification it may be drifting toward. Or Iran can do what it has increasingly done in this crisis, keep both tracks running at once. Talk on one side, threaten on the other, keep the talks alive, just enough to avoid full collapse, while using pressure at sea to prove it still has cards. That third path is messy, it is contradictory, it is also probably the most realistic. And then there is China. China's options are the least dramatic and maybe the most powerful. It can say very little in public, criticize escalation in general terms, and keep the oil and financing architecture alive in the background. It can quietly increase support that does not cross the threshold into direct war, but improves Iranian resilience. And above all, it can wait, because time in this structure does not work the same way for all three players. Time is expensive for America. Naval deployments are expensive. Repeated escalatory choices are expensive. Market instability is expensive. Time is dangerous for Iran, but not fatal, so long as the Chinese outer layer holds. And time is useful for China because every extra day in which America is forced to use more visible pressure without decisive strategic gain is another day in which China's model looks more relevant to the rest of the world. That is the deeper story here. The boarding of one ship is not the center of gravity. The center of gravity is the structure that made this move politically tempting for Washington and strategically useful for its rivals. You can see it in the timing. You can see it in the imagery. You can see it in the contradiction between talks still being whispered about and Marines still dropping onto a ship at night. This is what happens when a country starts acting as if forceful images can substitute for a stable political mechanism. And that is why I think this operation may end up doing the opposite of what its defenders claim. It may not break the talks immediately, but it makes a real deal harder. It may not hand Iran a military victory, but it hands the hardliners a political victory inside their own system. It may not prove full American control, but it reveals the limit of a blockade strategy that still cannot reach the external structure keeping Iran alive. And it may not start a wider war tomorrow, but it narrows the lane in which peace could still be negotiated. If you want the hardest version of the argument, it is this. The dangerous thing about the boarding is not that America used force. The dangerous thing is that America used force in a way that validates the enemy faction least interested in a deal without first solving the larger structure that keeps that faction from feeling cornered. That is how pressure stops being leverage and starts becoming self-sabotage. So when you look at the video, do not stop at the helicopters. Look at what the helicopters mean. A ship immobilized Marines descending, talks still unresolved. Iran split between diplomacy and defiance. China still sitting one layer back, saying little, underwriting more than it admits, and watching the strongest military in the world make a move that may have reduced its own room to maneuver. That is the picture. And if this diplomatic track fails, people will say the talks were never real, or Iran was never serious, or America had no choice. Maybe some of that will be true, but this much is already visible. When the negotiation window was already fragile, Washington chose the move most likely to convince Tehran's hardest men that fragility was the only reality. And once those men win the argument inside Iran, the sea gets more dangerous, the deal gets further away. And China's long game looks smarter to everyone watching. That is why this was not just a boarding, it was a political gift wrapped as an enforcement action.